Governor Christie spent the day in Washington, the only state official among 16 federal and international speakers at a conference on North American trade. And even though he softened his blistering criticism of President Obama, he took his shots, honing both his foreign policy creds and his presidential prospects. David Cruz is here with the story.
That's right, Mary Alice. It was the America's Society Council of the Americas Forum. The governor was actually interviewed by President and CEO Susan Siegel and took some audience questions. It lasted a little over a half hour, and the governor touched on some issues of interest to New Jersey residents, starting with immigration, an issue on which he's been critical of the president in the past, but otherwise today not very specific.
I think we need to define first what is the real circumstance that we're in as a country, what are we willing to engage in, and what are we just simply unable to deal with. And remember the motivation of most of these folks who have come, which is that they come here for greater economic opportunity to try to support not only themselves, but their families. And so all that has to be considered in the greater picture of also saying, as a country, we need to make sure that we have borders that respect our sovereignty.
Cuba came up, of course. President Obama has been working to normalize relations with the Castro regime, and that's something that the governor has talked about before and been critical about. Today, he was again adamant about one key issue.
If Cuba wants to be taken off the terrorist watch list, if Cuba wants to have normalized relations, then at a minimum, we should stop harboring terrorists. Joanne Chesimard is on the FBI's top 10 domestic terrorist watch list. How do we engage in these kind of conversations with Cuba if, in fact, they are harboring people who our own FBI has on the top 10 domestic terrorist watch list? So I have no problem with Cuba being welcomed back into the family of civilized nations, but you have to be civilized. And harboring a cop killer is not civilized conduct.
The governor called North America a pretty good neighborhood with Canada to the north and Mexico to the south. But he said, like any good neighborhood, it's important to stay in touch with your neighbors, which he said the current administration has failed to do.
We shouldn't be in the business as the United States of just calling our neighbors when we need something. And we shouldn't be in the business, quite frankly, of denying our friends reasonable accommodations when they ask for them. And that's why I think that the decision on Keystone was so misguided. It is not the act of a friend to deny reasonable accommodations to people when those accommodations are asked for. And Canada has shown over the period of recent history that they have made very difficult political and governmental decisions to support actions by the United States.
So it wasn't a comfy town hall style event, but the audience was friendly and respectful. And for Christie, with no major faux pas, not a bad day in D.C., Mary Alice.
But yesterday he did have a pretty bad day. He's dropping in the presidential polls. The Koch brothers seem to have dropped out of bankrolling him, and not one of his closest friends and political allies has just dropped 10 grand for Jeb Bush.
Yeah, Joe Carrillo, Senator Joe Carrillo, who was the chairman of the governor's 2009 election campaign, made a contribution to Jeb Bush back in March, just came out today as part of, or yesterday as part of the ELEC reports. And it also, in the Washington Post story, which reported this, Gail Gordon, who was a major Republican fundraiser in New Jersey, also expressed support for Jeb Bush. And so, you know, part of this has to do with in 2012, Carrillo's didn't feel like the governor did enough to support his campaign against Menendez. And then in 2013, the governor appointed Jeff Chiesa in that interim spot in the Senate. And Joe Carrillo thought that he should have been that man.
Do you see this as the beginning of a bunch of defections from the Christie camp?
Talking to a bunch of Republicans today, they seem to think that this is the beginning of the end for Christie as far as New Jersey Republicans supporting him. They said that, you know, they're complaining and then have been complaining about Christie using a lot of the state Republican funds to finance his trips and to really help his own political career, and that he hasn't done enough for statewide Republicans. They say he's raised money, but when he had a lot more political capital, they seem to think that he should have spent more of it on them, and instead he used a lot of it to help himself and felt like maybe, you know, all he needed to do was to raise funds for them. But they felt like, you know, they had a national star in New Jersey and that he should have shown a little bit of his sunshine on them, and he didn't. And it looks like right now the chickens in that case are coming home to roost.
Okay, David Cruz, thanks.
All right, Mary Alice.